You were never meant to struggle the way you did, not because something was wrong with you, but because something fundamental was misunderstood. For a long time, you were taught that real change announces itself loudly, that awakening shakes your life, that alignment arrives with chaos, intensity, and emotional force. And when that didn't happen, you assumed nothing was happening at all. Here's the twist. The most consequential shifts were never designed to feel dramatic. They were designed to feel quiet, stable, almost ordinary. The belief that transformation must be overwhelming was learned. It was conditioned. And because of that, you were trained to look for the wrong signal. January 26, 27 isn't an explosion point. It's a stabilization point, not an event that disrupts your life, but a moment where something inside you stops fighting. You may have already felt it. A strange calm, a reduction in urgency, a sense that something resolved itself without asking for your attention. No fireworks, no collapse, just less noise. And this is where things get interesting. When you expect intensity, calm feels invisible. When you expect chaos, clarity feels empty. So you keep waiting for proof, not realizing the proof already passed quietly through you. This isn't random. It isn't an external force descending on you. It's timing meeting readiness, awareness catching up to where you already are. You didn't become something new. Nothing was added to you. Something false was removed. And the simplicity of that is what makes it easy to miss. The truth is much simpler than the stories you were given. Real alignment doesn't rush you. It steadies you. It doesn't demand effort. It removes resistance. And when that happens, the mind doesn't celebrate. It goes silent. If you felt a subtle internal shift you couldn't explain, you're not imagining it. You just didn't have language for it yet. You were conditioned to distrust anything that didn't come with intensity. But calm is the marker. Reduced inattention is the signal. A quieter decision-making process is the evidence. You're hearing this now for a reason, because once this clicks, it can't be unseen. And once you stop chasing the old signs, you start recognizing what's actually happening. But to understand why this feels so different from what you expected, you need to see what a timeline change really is and what it was never meant to be. A timeline change isn't what most people think it is. It isn't a cosmic detour or a sudden rewrite of fate. It isn't the universe selecting you or testing you. That framing creates distance. It turns something intimate into something external, and that's why it feels confusing. A timeline change is internal alignment, nothing more dramatic than that. It's perception catching up to reality, awareness settling into coherence. When that happens, the future doesn't need to be forced. It reorganizes itself naturally because your internal signal has changed. January 26, 27 doesn't cause this. It reflects it, like a mirror held up at the right angle. If something shifts, it's because you were already ready. The date isn't power, it's timing, and timing only matters when readiness is present. Here's the part most people miss. This mechanism is already running in you. It always has been. You don't activate it by effort. You don't unlock it by understanding more concepts. It activates when resistance drops, when the internal noise softens enough for coherence to settle. That's why this feels familiar instead of new. You're not discovering something, you're recognizing it. The sensation is subtle because it's natural, like breathing when you stop paying attention to it. Alignment doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself once you stop interfering. The mechanism is simple. Awareness moves out of fragmentation and into unity. Decisions stop fighting each other. Emotions stop pulling in opposite directions. You don't feel euphoric. You feel clear, grounded, slightly quieter than before. And this is where simplicity becomes uncomfortable, because the mind wants drama. It wants something to do, but this shift doesn't give it a task. It takes one away. Thinking less allows the change to register. Not thinking about the shift is often how you notice it. Accessing this doesn't require a method. It requires orientation. A slight inward turn, less commentary, less urgency, less need to define what's happening. When you stop narrating your experience, awareness has space to settle. This is experiential, not conceptual. You won't figure it out. You'll notice it in the absence of strain, in the way choices feel obvious instead of debated, in how silence stops feeling empty. If that sounds almost too simple, that's not a flaw, that's the confirmation. But understanding this intellectually isn't enough to trust it. Trust comes when you see that others are quietly crossing the same threshold too. And that's where a single comment from a viewer becomes more revealing than any explanation. Recently, someone left a comment that didn't sound dramatic or excited. It wasn't celebratory, it was restrained. They said they felt strangely calm, and that calm scared them. They wrote about feeling like an old version of themselves was dissolving, not painfully, but quietly, as if something they'd been carrying simply loosened its grip. They didn't know whether to trust it. They didn't know what came next. They just knew they couldn't go back. That comment matters because it captures this stage precisely. The mix of relief and uncertainty, the sense of standing on unfamiliar ground without urgency to move, fear without panic, courage without performance. When identity softens, there's often a moment where you wonder who you are without the noise. That doesn't mean something is wrong. It means something is reorganizing. If you recognize yourself in that, you're not ahead or behind, you're right on time. This stage isn't about certainty, it's about readiness. And readiness doesn't feel like confidence. It feels like openness, like not needing to defend the old story anymore. Here, where comparison quietly sneaks in, you might notice others sensing shifts faster or speaking with more clarity and assume they're more aligned. But speed isn't the point. Readiness is. And readiness has nothing to do with being chosen, gifted, or special. Some people feel this sooner because they're less attached to the noise, less invested in explaining themselves, less committed to old identities that require constant maintenance. That's not superiority, it's availability. Resistance doesn't block the shift, it delays recognition of it. The shift still happens underneath. But if you're gripping old narratives, roles, or expectations, awareness can't settle cleanly. It has to work around the tension. This is why forcing progress backfires. The more you try to accelerate clarity, the more noise you generate. And noise is the only thing that actually slows this down. But to see why resistance shows up the way it does, you need to understand what's really interfering. And it's not fear in the way you've been taught to think about it. Resistance isn't dramatic. It doesn't always feel like fear or avoidance. Most of the time, it feels like activity, mental loops, background urgency, the subtle pressure to do something, understand something, fix something. That's the real divider, not belief, not intelligence, noise. This isn't a personal flaw. It's a byproduct of how modern life trains attention. Constant input, constant interpretation, constant stimulation. Even spiritual content can become noise when it's consumed as another thing to process instead of something to notice. Here's the twist. Awareness doesn't compete with noise, it waits. It doesn't force its way through. So if the mind is crowded, coherence can't settle, not because you're blocked, but because there's no space. Readiness then isn't about effort, it's about availability, less gripping, less commentary, less urgency to label what's happening. When resistance loosens, even slightly, the shift becomes obvious, not louder, clearer. This is why some people feel this earlier. They're not doing more, they're interfering less. They've loosened their attachment to old internal roles, the fixer, the seeker, the one who's always preparing for the next step. And here's the part most people miss. The true block isn't fear of change, it's overstimulation, too many signals, too many narratives, too much mental movement. The system stays activated even when nothing is wrong. That's why clarity often arrives when you stop consuming, when you pause, when the internal volume drops. It's not mystical, it's physiological attention settling, and when that happens, alignment doesn't need to be chased, it's noticed. Modern life amplifies the interference. Notifications, opinions, predictions, endless explanations. They all reinforce the idea that something is always about to happen instead of allowing you to recognize what already has. So the solution isn't withdrawal or discipline, it's discernment, knowing when to step out of the noise long enough for awareness to recalibrate. And once that recalibration begins, timing suddenly matters, but not in the way fear-based narratives suggest. When timing matters here, it's not because something bad will happen if you miss it. It's because momentum is present. Alignment creates movement naturally, and when awareness clears, even briefly, direction becomes easier to feel, not forced, obvious. Urgency in this context isn't pressure, it's availability, a window where the old patterns loosen just enough for something quieter to take the lead. If that window closes, nothing is lost, but the system tends to fall back into familiar loops, the same internal negotiations, the same delays disguised as preparation. And here's the part most people miss. Delay isn't neutral, it reinforces identity. Every time clarity appears and is ignored, the old structure tightens slightly, not as punishment, as habit. That's why small moments matter more than dramatic decisions. Direction shifts when you respond to clarity while it's present, not when you wait for certainty. This doesn't require a leap. It requires recognition, a subtle yes, a decision made without internal debate. Those moments recalibrate the trajectory quietly, and over time, the accumulation of quiet alignment produces visible change without effort. If you're in this window, the first signs won't be external. You won't feel excited, you'll feel settled. The internal arguments reduce, you stop rehearsing explanations. Choices feel cleaner, not easier, cleaner. You may notice you're less reactive, less pulled into urgency that doesn't belong to you. There's a grounded presence that replaces anticipation. You're not waiting for something to happen, you're already here. This is often mistaken for stagnation, especially by those conditioned to equate movement with intensity. But this steadiness is movement. It's coherence replacing friction, energy no longer leaking through indecision. You might also notice something else. Silence feels different, not empty, complete. There's less need to fill space with thought or distraction. Awareness rests more naturally. These are not fantasies, they're subtle internal markers, and because they don't impress the ego, they're easy to dismiss, but they are reliable. If you're noticing them now, you're not early, you're not late, you're aligned with the timing of your own system. Still, there's a phase that often follows this clarity that catches people off guard. A moment where the old self hasn't fully dissolved and the new orientation hasn't fully stabilized yet. And if you're not prepared for that middle space, it can feel confusing unless you understand what it actually means. When clarity first settles in, there's often a strange in-between phase. Nothing feels wrong, but nothing feels fully defined either. The old identity doesn't fit the way it used to. The urgency that once drove you is quieter, and without that familiar pressure, there can be a sense of disorientation. This is where many people think they're regressing. They assume the calm means they've lost motivation, or that the absence of emotional charge means something has gone flat. But this discomfort is not a warning, it's a confirmation. It's what happens when noise dissolves faster than the mind can reorganize around simplicity. The old structure was built on reaction, on constant feedback, on effort as proof of progress. When that dissolves, the system needs time to recalibrate. Silence feels unfamiliar, space feels undefined, and the mind, used to movement, briefly doesn't know what to do with ease. That doesn't mean the shift is unstable. It means it's real. Alignment removes friction, and friction was what previously gave identity its shape. Without it, you're not empty, you're unburdened, and learning to trust that takes a moment. You're not late, you didn't miss anything. There is nothing to catch up to. What's unfolding isn't a race or a test. It's a natural correction, one that doesn't require effort, belief, or performance, only allowance. The truth is much simpler than the narratives suggest. When awareness stabilizes, life doesn't need to be forced. Decisions organize themselves. Direction clarifies without pressure. You're not being pulled forward. You're settling into what's already aligned. If something in you recognized this without needing to analyze it, that matters. If a quiet yes registered somewhere beneath thought, trust that. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to act immediately. Awareness already did its work. You're hearing this now for a reason, not to convince you, but to name what you may have already felt. And once that's named, the process continues on its own, calmly and inevitably. If something here resonated, you can acknowledge it with a simple like. If you know someone who's been noticing a similar quiet shift, sharing this may help them trust it. And if you want to stay connected to this kind of clarity-based exploration, subscribing keeps that door open. You can also leave a comment about what you notice changing, even subtly. Whatever you choose, know this: alignment doesn't rush you, it meets you where you are, and then it stays.